To the point of the palace, because there would have been staff there. They would have seen what was going on, the comings and goings within the palace. It was also revealed that there was a creepy code word.
She was 100 years old when she finally sat down with the King of England over a cup of tea. A woman who had spent decades inside Buckingham Palace's most private rooms, who had changed royal nappies, dried royal tears, and watched royal children grow into the figures the world now knows. The king who came to visit, the man who had reportedly promised for years he would mark this milestone with her, was one of the children she had once cared for herself. His name is Charles. Her name is Mabel Anderson. But here's what has royal watchers buzzing. Because Charles wasn't the child Mabel was most remembered for talking about. The stories that followed her through decades, resurfacing in books, newspapers, and royal accounts, were about a different prince entirely. Andrew, and the nickname she gave him wasn't flattering. Not the kind of name you give a future duke or decorated war veteran, the kind you give a child who cannot be controlled, who leaves chaos wherever he goes. She called him the young imp, and on the harder days, when palace staff were at their wits' end, she called him something even less kind than that. The question is whether anyone was truly listening. Because those childhood nicknames are no longer just amusing royal trivia. They look, in hindsight, like a warning nobody took seriously, until it was far too late. Who was Mabel Anderson, and why does her word carry weight? Before we get into what she said about Andrew, you need to understand who Mabel Anderson actually was. Because in a world full of royal commentators, royal biographers, and royal insiders, who have varying degrees of access and varying degrees of credibility, Anderson sits in a category almost entirely by herself. She was not a journalist piecing together a story from second-hand accounts. She was not a biographer reconstructing events from old archives. She was not a former palace staffer with an axe to grind selling a memoir for the headlines. Mabel Anderson was the royal nanny. She worked inside the royal household for years. She cared for Queen Elizabeth II's children directly, King Charles, Princess Anne, Prince Andrew, and Prince Edward. She was in the nursery. She was at the bedside. She was present for the private moments that never made it into official royal portraits or state announcements. And she remained close to the royal family for decades after her professional role ended. That closeness, the fact that Charles himself traveled to see her personally on her 100th birthday, delivering the traditional royal telegram and sitting with her over tea, tells you everything you need to know about how the family regarded her. This was not a woman the palace wanted to distance itself from. This was someone they trusted, someone they respected, someone who had kept their secrets for a very long time. Which makes what she said about Andrew all the more significant. When Mabel Anderson described the young prince as the young imp, she was not performing for a camera or chasing a headline. She was sharing what she had witnessed firsthand, day after day, inside the walls of the most famous royal household in the world. According to accounts reported in the Mail and referenced in Nigel Cawthorne's book covering the monarchy and the Epstein scandal, Anderson's recollections painted a picture of a child who was, even by palace standards, exceptionally difficult. And the question royal watchers are now asking, the question that has taken on a very different weight in recent months, is whether that child ever really changed at all, born into a different royal world. To understand Andrew, you have to understand the specific circumstances he was born into. Because unlike his older siblings, Andrew's entry into royal life happened at a moment when everything had already been locked into place. Charles and Anne were both born before their mother became queen in 1952. That matters. It means they spent their earliest years in something closer to a private family environment before the full weight of the monarchy descended on their household. They knew a version of royal life that still had some edges of ordinary childhood around it. Andrew was different. He was born in 1960, 8 years into his mother's reign. By that point, Queen Elizabeth II was not simply a mother. She was the head of state of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. The palace machinery was fully operational. The staff was fully deployed. The rituals, the protocols, the formalities, all of it was already running at full power when Andrew arrived. What that translated to in practical terms was extraordinary. According to accounts in the book referencing Anderson's recollections, Andrew had access to 7 different nurseries across multiple royal palaces. 7. Not one nursery in one home. 7 separate spaces in 7 separate royal residences. He was surrounded by staff, surrounded by luxury, surrounded by a level of privilege and attention that his older siblings had not experienced at the same age and in quite the same form. Now ask yourself this: what happens to a child who grows up with that kind of environment from their very first day of life? What happens when every need is met before it is even expressed? When every room you enter is staffed and serviced and arranged around your comfort? When the word no is a concept that rarely applies to you in any meaningful way? Some children navigate that environment and emerge with discipline, purpose, and a sense of duty. Some do not. The nanny's nickname for Andrew suggests which category he fell into early on. Baby Grumpling, the name that tells a story. The young imp was the nickname that made the most headlines. But Anderson reportedly had a second one for Andrew that in some ways reveals even more. She called him Baby Grumpling. That name reportedly came from the young prince's frequent temper tantrums and stubborn streak. According to the stories Anderson shared later in life, Andrew was constantly getting into mischief around the palace. Some of it was relatively harmless, some of it was significantly less so. There is the story of the radio. At some point during his childhood years, Andrew allegedly removed every single valve from his nanny's radio, leaving it completely unusable. This was not a childish accident. This was a deliberate act. The kind of act that requires patience, intention, and a willingness to destroy something that belongs to someone else without a second thought about the consequences. Then there is the shoelace story. According to the accounts Anderson shared, the young prince reportedly tied together the shoelaces of palace sentries. These are men in full ceremonial uniform, standing in formal positions, who could easily have suffered a serious fall. What strikes royal observers about this particular story is not just the mischief involved, it is the target. Andrew was not pulling pranks on people his own age. He was targeting adults in a position of duty who could not respond the way a parent or a sibling might. He was testing the limits of what he could get away with, and the answer, apparently, was quite a lot. But perhaps the most audacious story of all, and the one that says the most about the environment Andrew grew up in, is the itching powder incident. According to the accounts that have circulated for years, Andrew once poured itching powder into Queen Elizabeth's own bed inside Buckingham Palace. The Queen's bed, not a sibling's bed, not a staff member's bed. The Queen's bed. And what was the response? What was the consequence? According to reports, Queen Elizabeth herself commented on the prank with what was described as a hint of frustration. Her exact words, as they have been reported, were that Andrew is not always a little ray of sunshine about the home. A hint of frustration. That was it. Her son had put itching powder in her bed, and the recorded response was a mild, almost amused complaint about him not being a ray of sunshine. Stop and sit with that for a moment, because that reaction, or more precisely, the absence of a real reaction, tells you as much about the environment Andrew was raised in as the prank itself. In most households, a child who puts itching powder in a parent's bed faces a consequence. In the palace, that same act generated a wry comment, and apparently nothing more. When you raise a child to believe that disruption has no cost, what kind of adult do you end up with? The schoolboy, the sailor, and the Falklands hero. After the nursery years, Andrew was sent to Heatherdown School in Ascot, a traditional preparatory school with connections to several aristocratic families. From there, he went on to Gordonstoun in Scotland, the same institution that King Charles had attended years earlier. Here is where the brothers diverge in a revealing way. Charles reportedly found Gordonstoun extremely difficult. The school was known for its demanding environment, its cold showers, its emphasis on resilience and physical discipline, and its deliberate rejection of the comforts that royal children were accustomed to. For Charles, by most accounts, it was a difficult and often lonely experience. Andrew reportedly adapted to Gordonstoun without the same struggles. Whether that says something about the differences in their personalities, their temperaments, or simply the years between their attendances is open to interpretation. But the contrast between a sensitive, academically serious older brother who found the environment bruising and a younger, more physically confident brother who seemed at ease there is worth noting. After school, Andrew joined the Royal Navy and trained as a helicopter pilot. And then came the moment that, for a period, defined him entirely in the British public imagination: the Falklands War, 1982. Andrew served during that conflict, flying helicopter missions for the Royal Navy. His role was real, his presence in the conflict zone was real, and the respect it earned him was genuine. Back in Britain, his popularity rose sharply. He was described as one of the monarchy's most charismatic figures. He had gone from the mischievous Prince of Palace rumor to a military man who had put himself in harm's way for his country. The image transformation was remarkable. Here was the young imp, grown up, disciplined, decorated, serving with honor. Or so it appeared. The fall, and how far it goes. It is difficult to overstate how dramatically Andrew's reputation has reversed since those Falklands years, because the distance between where he was then and where he stands now is not a short journey. It is a complete reversal of identity. King Charles has stripped him of his military titles and royal patronages. He no longer carries out royal duties. He does not appear at official engagements. He rarely attends public family gatherings. He was removed from Royal Lodge, the large Windsor residence where he had lived for years, and relocated to Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, a significantly smaller property that had previously been used by the late Prince Philip during his retirement years. The symbolism of that relocation is hard to miss. The Queen's favorite son, the prince who grew up with 7 nurseries across multiple palaces, reduced to living in a modest property on an estate he no longer has any formal role within. The progression from palace to Wood Farm is the physical map of a fall from grace. And then came the morning of his 66th birthday, arrested on his birthday. On the morning of February 19th, Andrew's 66th birthday, police arrived at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate. He was arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office. The investigation reportedly relates to allegations that Andrew may have shared sensitive information with Jeffrey Epstein during the years he served as the United Kingdom's trade envoy. That role ran from 2001 to 2011, a decade in which Andrew was officially representing Britain in trade negotiations and business engagements around the world. A decade in which, according to what investigators are now examining, he may have been sharing information with one of the most dangerous and connected criminals of the modern era. Police confirmed that a man in his 60s from Norfolk had been arrested and later released under investigation after being questioned for several hours. In the statement released that same day, Thames Valley Police confirmed that officers had carried out searches connected to the case in Norfolk and that those searches had concluded. Andrew spent approximately 11 hours in custody before being released. 11 hours. On his birthday. Questioned about what he may have told a man whose name now appears in connection with abuse networks that reached across governments, institutions, and continents. The exact details of the alleged information sharing remain unclear. But reports suggest investigators are examining communications between Andrew and associates connected to Epstein during his years as trade envoy, years during which he had access to sensitive government-adjacent information and was moving in exactly the circles where that information would have had value. And here is the question that hangs over all of it. If those communications existed, if that information was shared, then what does it mean for a prince who was already stripped of his titles, already living in reduced circumstances, already cut off from the working royal family? What does it mean for someone who, by this point, had very few official roles left to lose? The Epstein connection, and what it changed. It is impossible to discuss Andrew's current situation without addressing the Epstein connection directly, because that association is not a footnote in Andrew's story. It is the central axis around which his entire fall from grace turns. Jeffrey Epstein was a financier and convicted sex offender who ran one of the most extensively documented abuse networks of the modern era. His connections stretched across the highest levels of politics, finance, entertainment, and royal circles. When his crimes became fully public and when he died in custody in August 2019, the blast radius of the scandal reached into virtually every corner of elite society he had ever touched. Andrew was one of the most prominent names connected to him. The infamous BBC Newsnight interview in November 2019, in which Andrew attempted to address those connections directly, became one of the most widely discussed television disasters in recent memory. His responses were widely criticized as evasive, tone-deaf, and in several cases simply implausible. Within days, he had stepped back from royal duties. Within a short period after that, he lost his military titles and royal patronages at the instruction of King Charles. But the arrest on his birthday this year signals that the legal scrutiny is not finished. It may, in fact, be only beginning. If the investigation finds evidence that Andrew actively shared sensitive British trade-related intelligence with Epstein or his associates during that decade as trade envoy, the implications extend well beyond his personal reputation. They extend into questions about national security, about the vulnerability of privileged access, about what happens when someone in an official capacity uses that position in ways that cross fundamental lines. It is a long way from itching powder in the Queen's bed. And yet, for people who have been paying attention to Andrew's story for a long time, there is a thread that connects all of it. A thread that Mabel Anderson may have identified before almost anyone else. The thread that runs through it all. Here is what makes Anderson's childhood recollections so striking in retrospect. The pranks she described were not random acts of childhood chaos. They were specific. They involved targeting people who were in positions where they could not fully respond to him. The palace sentries whose shoelaces he tied, men standing at formal attention who could not break protocol to address a royal child, his nanny, whose radio he disabled, a member of staff who could not punish a prince the way a parent might punish a child, his own mother, the Queen, in whose bed he put itching powder and whose response was nothing more than a mild, exasperated comment. What Anderson was describing, even in the affectionate, half-amused way that these stories were often told, was a child who had learned very early that rules applied differently to him. That power created a buffer between his actions and their consequences, that he could push boundaries that other people could not push, and the world would accommodate him. The young imp baby Grumpling. These are funny nicknames when the subject is a small boy racing through palace corridors. They read very differently when that same boy is a 66-year-old man being questioned for 11 hours by police about what he may have shared with one of history's most notorious criminals. What Charles's visit to Anderson really means. The timing of King Charles's visit to Mabel Anderson on her 100th birthday was, depending on how you read it, either a beautiful coincidence or a quietly charged moment. According to reports in the Telegraph, Charles had promised for years that he would visit Anderson when she reached that milestone. He kept that promise. He traveled to see her. They sat together over tea. He delivered the royal telegram. The two of them, the king and the woman who helped raise him, spent time together in a setting that was, by all accounts, warm and personal. But the visit happened shortly after Andrew's arrest. At a moment when the name that came up most often in connection with Anderson's recollections of the royal nursery was not Charles, it was Andrew. And so Charles's presence there, his loyalty to this woman who had been part of his earliest childhood, who had witnessed what he and his siblings were like before the world was watching, carried an unspoken dimension. Here was the king, honoring a woman who had known all of them, at a moment when his brother's name was appearing in police statements and newspaper headlines for the second time in his adult life. Royal watchers noted it, and they noted that the stories Anderson had told about Andrew, the nickname, the pranks, the stubbornness, the temper, were now circulating again in a completely different context. From nursery to Norfolk, the full arc. Stand back and look at the full arc of Andrew's life, and something uncomfortable comes into focus. A boy born into extraordinary privilege, with access and luxury that exceeded even what his older siblings experienced. A boy whose earliest behavior was flagged by the woman responsible for managing it, who gave him not one, but two unflattering nicknames. A boy whose pranks were not punished in any meaningful way because the environment around him simply could not hold him accountable the way a normal household would. A boy whose mother's most recorded response to his worst behavior was mild, sighing exasperation. That boy grew into a young man who went to war and was genuinely brave. That part of his story is real and should not be erased. The Falklands service was not theater. He put himself in danger and he served with professionalism. For a period, it looked as though the discipline of military life had done what the palace nursery could not, shaped Andrew into someone whose behavior matched the weight of his position. But the discipline did not hold. Or perhaps the discipline was always in conflict with something deeper, a foundational belief built in those earliest years across 7 nurseries and 7 palaces. That consequence was something that happened to other people. Today, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor lives at Wood Farm. He carries no royal duties. He does not appear at public engagements. He is no longer a working royal. He is under investigation. And the stories being told about him, the most recent stories, the ones that involve police and custody suites and allegations of misconduct in public office, are a world away from the anecdotes about shoelaces and itching powder. But they are not, if you look carefully enough, a world away from the personality those anecdotes described. What does the monarchy do now? King Charles has spent years deliberately reshaping the public face of the British monarchy. The emphasis is on a smaller, leaner group of working royals. The emphasis is on relevance, on service, on separating the institution from the individuals whose behavior threatens it. Andrew is the most visible casualty of that reshaping process, but his situation creates problems that cannot simply be managed through removal from public duties. Because an investigation of this kind, into whether a member of the royal family shared sensitive government-adjacent information with a convicted sex offender and his network, does not stay in the background. It draws attention. It raises questions. It forces the monarchy into the frame of a story it desperately does not want to be part of. There have been discussions, reportedly, about Andrew's place in the line of succession. Some commentators have raised the possibility that formal steps could be taken to remove him from it. No official announcement has been made, but the fact that the conversation is happening at all tells you something about how seriously the institution is taking the threat he now represents to the monarchy's carefully managed image. And somewhere in Norfolk, in a modest property on the Sandringham estate, the Queen's favorite son, the child who once tipped itching powder into the Queen's bed and tied sentries' shoelaces in palace corridors, is waiting to find out what comes next. The question nobody can fully answer. There is a question that sits underneath all of this that is genuinely difficult to answer, and it is this: how much does a childhood tell you about an adult? Mabel Anderson's recollections of Andrew are vivid and specific. They come from a credible source who had no obvious motive to fabricate or exaggerate. They describe a child with a particular set of characteristics: impulsive, stubborn, boundary-pushing, comfortable taking risks, unwilling to accept the kind of accountability that normal life imposes on most people. But childhood is not destiny. People change. Environments shape and reshape personality over decades. Andrew's military service demonstrates clearly that he was capable of discipline and courage when those qualities were demanded of him. The narrative of an unchanging character who simply acted out his nursery personality on a larger stage over a lifetime is too neat, too simple. And yet, when you trace the specific pattern of Andrew's adult controversies, the associations he chose to maintain despite warnings, the interviews he gave without apparently understanding how they would land, the apparent belief that his position insulated him from the kind of scrutiny and consequence that others would face, you see something that rhymes, if not quite repeats, with what Anderson described in the nursery. A person who did not fully believe the rules applied to him. A person whose earliest experience of the world taught him that disruption had a different cost for royals than it did for everyone else. Mabel Anderson called him baby grumpling because of the tantrums. She called him the young imp because of the mischief. She watched him more closely than almost anyone outside his immediate family during those formative years. And the king who sat with her over tea on her 100th birthday, the older brother who had watched Andrew's long, painful fall from favor, knows better than anyone what those nicknames really meant and what it cost the family that they were never taken seriously enough. The final thought. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was born into a life that most human beings cannot imagine. Royal palaces, royal nurseries, royal privilege stretching in every direction as far as the eye could see. He had a nanny who was with him from his earliest days, who kept his secrets and managed his behavior and loved him in the particular, exhausted, affectionate way that people love difficult children who are in their care. She gave him 2 nicknames. She told her stories to people who listened. And then she lived to 100 years old and watched the king she had also raised come to visit her with tea and telegrams and loyalty that had endured across decades. And somewhere in the background of that visit, Andrew's name was in the news again, the young impid baby grumpling. From palace corridors to police custody. From the Queen's favorite son to a man living in a downsized house on a royal estate, stripped of titles, under investigation, largely invisible in the public life of the institution he was born into. The nanny saw it first. She just did it with a nickname. Now we are all watching the rest of the story play out. And the question for you is this. Do you think the signs were always there from the beginning? Do you think the people around Andrew saw what Mabel Anderson saw and simply chose not to act on it? Or is this one of those stories where hindsight makes everything look inevitable when it wasn't? Drop your answer in the comments, because this story is far from over.